The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Dr. Chase Lopez stood close to the shoreline, his rubber boots mere inches from where the inky water lapped like tongues at the sand. To me, it looked as if he was teasing it. The ocean reached, but never quite far enough to touch. Dr. Lopez's face was buried in his cell phone. He said, "Come look at this, Lena." I hesitated to duck under the yards of yellow caution tape suspended around the beach, preventing locals and tourists from entering these waters. The stench of it was strong enough from where I stood. Dr. Lopez must have been drowning in it. The smell made the air seem heavy, like you were breathing in something solid. It stuck on my tongue, metallic. The ocean reeked of blood. It took me time, but I forced myself to walk closer to the source. Dr. Lopez held out his phone to me, and I had to squint and cup my hands over the screen to see it in the sunlight. The chemical analysis of the water, fresh from our main lab, just came in, he said, and it's not oil. BP lives to see another day. Then what the hell is it? We don't know. Dr. Lopez tucked his phone into his pocket and looked into the ocean. Not yet. At least, I'm waiting for more to come through from Maine. That's just preliminary stuff. What does it smell like to you? It smells like blood. And it's so dark. Could be mass amounts of squid ink. However impossible that may be, chemical analysis would have clocked that. Right. Well, not much we can do but wait. The ocean that stretched out before us was black, with a telescope on the ground and a helicopter in the sky. We could see that this dark patch existed 75 or so feet out from the shore. It was big, but not exactly oil spill big. Beachgoers noticed the black tide rolling in a few days ago, and soon after, dead fish and other sea life began to wash ashore. The weird thing about the dead fish was that they didn't rot. By the time we arrived, they had been roasting on the beach for over 2 days, yet none of the expected effects of decomposition were present. They were in suspended animation, dead, but not looking like it, not even picked apart by gulls or other scavengers. The birds disappeared when the black tide rolled in. We found several species of fish native to this part of the Pacific, a few jellyfish, and one angel shark in the menagerie. They seemed so alive that, at first, we researchers tried to revive them. I put one orange fish inside a tank and was dismayed to find it floated belly up. There it stayed, never decomposing, for the remainder of our time on the island. On our second day there, Dr. Lopez told me that the lab results were inconclusive. "What the hell does that mean?" I said. "Can you at least tell me if it has sodium and chloride in it?" It was supposed to be a joke, but Dr. Lopez just shook his head at me. "No, Lena, I'm telling you they don't know. Whatever it's made of, it's not something we've ever seen before. It's not even blood." I Saturday down. I'd never gotten such devastating or exciting news. Something new, something we could put our names on. But where to begin? How could we possibly know its dangers if we couldn't even tell what it was made of? I didn't know what reaction was appropriate to have. It has to be something. Chase, it came from Earth, didn't it? Maybe it's a chemical runoff that some goddamn plastic company shit out into the ocean. An experimental sort of thing. They didn't detect any polymers. He went on. Not a bad guess. Though, what do we do now? Are they running more tests? Doctor. Lopez looked around the tiny space. We occupied a local resort room, which was converted to suit our needs as we did our research. The resort's residents were forced to evacuate when the black tide arrived. There were bunk beds that Dr. Lopez and I shared with 2 others, another marine biologist named Carmen, and an environmental engineer named Gabriel. There were local military guys around, too, but only to keep the tourists at bay. Excitement about the mysterious black ocean was palpable. "Maybe we dive," Dr. Lopez suggested. I blanched. "Chase, that substance killed those fish, whatever it is. It's toxic. We've got diving suits. It's the 21st century. It won't touch our skin." So we got ready to dive. It wasn't my place to refuse an order from my superior, and I knew that being scared was no viable excuse. Carmen agreed to dive with us, but Gabriel would go no further than the shore. He tagged along to watch from a safe distance. We slipped into diving gear and stood at the edge, just an inch from where the black tide sucked in and out. Carmen shrugged her shoulders at it. "Well, I guess I'll go first if everyone is going to be a pussy about it." She walked out into the ocean. I watched her while holding my breath. I expected her to zip beneath the obsidian surface, pulled to her death by some terrible monster. I expected her to scream as the substance ate through her suit, and ultimately, her skin. I expected her to collapse and die like the fish did, silently poisoned. None of this happened. Carmen waded out several yards until she could swim, then dived beneath the water. From the radio, she said, "Come on in, folks, the water's warm." Dr. Lopez and I followed her. The water was warm. As we sank beneath it, we noticed a peculiar phenomenon, the black tide Saturday on top of the water, never mixing. It was about 20 inches thick. The temperature difference was notable. The water below the blackness was freezing, almost as if it had been siphoned of its heat. I reached my hand into it, and it was a jarring sensation to feel such warmth while the rest of me shivered. A strange sight indeed, Dr. Lopez muttered. We were staring upward into space. That's what it looked like to me. If I close my eyes, I can go back to that moment. I'm suspended in the cold ocean, staring up at an inky night sky that blocks out the light of the sun. If I stare long enough, I see little pinpricks of starlight glitter throughout it. It's almost beautiful. It is beautiful. I feel compelled to go into it and remain there in its warm embrace, floating in the atmosphere, stars rippling around me. I started to swim upward, then a voice. "Get out of the water," Gabriel commanded. Dr. Lopez caught my arm, and I came to my senses. "What's up, Gabe?" he asked. "Get out, now." We turned and swam toward the shore. The feeling of coming up through the black tide was indescribable, warm and wonderful. My skin exploded into goosebumps as I emerged from it. I wanted to go back. I was tired. I could sleep in that water. Carmen was the last one to emerge, and she walked backward. She knocked into Dr. Lopez and didn't seem to notice. "Jesus H. Christ," she said. "What the hell?" I saw it. Saw them. A dozen shark fins slowly moving through the black water toward the shoreline. Each shark's fin was different. The tide gently pushed them ashore in a neat little row, heads facing us and tails toward the sea. There were 12 different species of shark, all of them dead. "Fuck," Dr. Lopez said. "What are the odds?" The sight struck me numb. This felt purposeful, an arrangement made to be seen, a presentation. I couldn't get any closer. The water didn't feel inviting anymore. It felt hostile. Suddenly I had the urge to look away from it, as if I had met a stranger's eye for too long. "That's an Atlantic sharpnose." Carmen pointed at one of them. "How the hell is it here, in the Pacific?" "What is that one?" Gabriel asked, pointing at another. This shark was not something I'd ever seen before. It was dark pink, almost red. Adorning its head were small horns arranged like a crown. "It can't be," Dr. Lopez said. "Can't be what?" He walked to it and crouched down, despite our protests. He grabbed the dead shark and inspected its head and the inside of its mouth. His fingers tapped along its teeth like he was a dentist, counting each one aloud. Sliding his hand along the gills and peering into its eye, he finally stood, and I saw him trembling as he turned to us. I could be wrong, but this looks like a hibiscus. "A what?" I asked. "Opportunistic bugger," he went on, really fast. "Lived about 100 million years ago, if I remember correctly. It's been extinct since the late Cretaceous period. None of us believed him. Carmen was the first to call him crazy. I didn't know much about extinct marine life, but I knew this wasn't possible. It must just look like a hybridus, perhaps a mutated something else. We called for help and lugged the sharp nose and the maybe hybridus back to our makeshift lab. Dr. Lopez called a marine archaeologist and a paleontologist. I went to the bathroom and inspected every inch of my skin. That intoxicating warmth was long forgotten. I was utterly disgusted at the thought of having been in that black water. I expected a red rash, weeping abrasions, and infection, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just my skin. Something strange happened the next day. Gabriel began talking about the black tide like it was a person. She did that on purpose, he said at breakfast. She wanted us to see those sharks. Who's she? Carmen asked. She was busy buttering a slice of bread. I watched her do it and noticed there was a minor cut on her pointer finger. Gabriel seemed irritated. The black water, that was a message to us. What kind of message? Gabe, Carmen taunted. That it can resurrect sharks from a gazillion years ago. Give me a fucking break. She's older than us. Smarter, maybe. They argued, and I left. Dr. Lopez's people came later that afternoon with more equipment and knowledge. They fawned over the shark, spent hours alone in a refrigerated room with it, came out and swore to us it's an extinct species. They began calling more people, bigwigs from huge universities. This tide didn't seem like it was ours anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night to find that Gabriel was missing from his bunk. I couldn't go back to sleep. With rising concern, I surmised he may just be using the bathroom, taking a walk, talking to a loved one in a different time zone. But I knew that wasn't the case. So I rose from bed and went to the window. I saw Gabriel on the shore. He was walking toward the tide. Fear gripped me. It was like watching someone standing atop a skyscraper about to jump. Helpless panic. Impending doom. Chase. Carmen. Wake up, I shouted. Gabriel's walking toward the fucking water. What? Carmen groaned. Doctor! Lopez rolled over to face the wall. I shook him harder, and he finally sat up. Lena, seriously. Can we please go check on him? I'm worried. I mean, why is he out there at this hour? Doctor! Lopez had been my supervisor for 3 years. Before that, he was my professor and personal advisor. He rarely said no to me. He got out of bed and followed me out of the resort and toward the black tide. The moon was full, and the beach was illuminated in pale blue. As we approached, I noticed that the light didn't reflect off the surface of the black water. It was consumed by it, like a void. It had been different in the sun. The rays reflect back at you, almost blinding. Why should the moonlight be different? Gabriel was nowhere to be seen. Doctor! Lopez and I ducked beneath the caution tape and walked as far as we were willing to. The black tide was still. If I didn't know better, I'd have said it was a solid sheet of blackness lying on top of the ocean. Fanta black. Blacker than black. Black hole. I wanted to touch it, to see if it was the same thing we encountered in the daylight, or if something else had replaced it. Then Gabriel appeared. He was floating face down in the void, several yards from the shore. Slowly, his body began to move toward us. He looked like he was in space, a place where there are millions of light years between stars and planets, and there's absolutely no light, just his partially submerged body, suspended in eternity, moving forward with such ease and purpose that there could have been a conveyor belt beneath him. My body felt drained of its blood. I was cold with fright. When I moved toward the water, Dr. Lopez grabbed me. Don't, he whispered. Don't go in there. Gabriel's body stopped floating toward us. It was frozen in the blackness, like a movie on pause. We stayed where we were, and I felt sick enough to puke. We can't leave him there. I think, Dr. Lopez started, then paused. I could hear him swallow. I think it wants us to go in. Gabriel's body reanimated and floated backward, away from the shore. I was disgusted with myself for not going after him. What if he's still alive, not yet drowned? He floated back several more feet, stopped, and then started toward us again. I knew what Dr. Lopez meant now. These aren't the movements of the natural current. These movements are deliberate, teasing, controlled. Gabriel got close enough to the shore that we could touch him. With hubris, I crouched down and reached for his arm. "Doctor!" Lopez jerked me away, just as Gabriel zipped backward and slipped beneath the surface, blinked out of existence. TV turned off. We fell into the sand and scrambled away from the water's edge. Hot tears filled my eyes. Dr. Lopez was silent. We waited, unable to move. A few yards out, Gabriel's body appeared again, static in the void. In the daylight, we pulled Gabriel out using lifeguard equipment. He was dead, but he looked alive, asleep. When the paramedics put him on a stretcher, inky liquid spilled from his lips. We all jumped away from it. One paramedic cursed as they started to take him toward the ambulance, where a medical doctor would pronounce him dead at a hospital. "We can't allow this, Doctor," Lopez hissed. He ran after them. "Wait, we must keep the body here. The water may be infected, and it wouldn't be safe to take him to a hospital full of compromised people." I knew what he was doing because I thought the same thing. I wanted to see if Gabriel's body was going to decompose. Carmen was oddly stoic when I gave her the news about Gabriel. She said something strange that made me uneasy. He answered her call. Perhaps she was making fun of him for the previous day's conversation, which seemed cruel even for gruff Carmen. As I sat with her, I noticed the cut on her finger was redder, inflamed. "What's up with your hand?" I asked. She hid it between her thighs. "Paper cut. It's been itchy, so I made it worse." I wondered if she had that cut when we went diving. Somehow, Dr. Lopez convinced the paramedics to leave Gabriel's body with us. We took him wrapped in a body bag to the refrigerated room where we laid out some sharks and other dead things. He mentioned something about his pockets being lighter now, and I understood. Bribing a paramedic to leave our dead colleague's body here for us to study. Is this what we had come to? It was insanity. A tech from the main lab called us not long after we stored Gabriel in the room. "Have you noticed the phenomenon evaporating, or dissipating at all?" "No," I said. "It's still there. Nothing has changed as far as we can see." "Weird," he said. "All the samples you sent us are gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "Well, it's gone. Completely vanished overnight. Now all we have are tubes of plain old Pacific Ocean water. We can't find a trace of the stuff anywhere." I didn't know what to make of it. Neither did they. Neither did Carmen or Dr. Lopez. For the first time in my career, I felt stupid. More than that, I felt gullible, like I'd been tricked here on a wild goose chase. Paranoia compelled me to go back to the shore and see if the substance was still there. It was. A day later, word got out about the extinct shark, and reporters started to show up. The local government had kept our secret well, but someone was loose-lipped. I suspected it was one of the two that Dr. Lopez called in. Journalists lined the perimeter of the shore and reached over guards to snap photos. Soon, it would be all over the news. Some guards grabbed cameras and smashed them into the sand, but not everyone could be caught. We were stuck, unable to categorize the black tide, unable to make sense of the dead but not decomposing corpses, and unable to find answers. Now that the press flocked, we were too uncomfortable to do our research under their curious eyes. After the accident, it felt wrong to get close to it anyhow. Dr. Lopez didn't want to discuss with me the events of Gabriel's death, yet he had been the one to ascribe malicious intention to the water that night. Told me that it wants us to go in, and I believed him, still do. Sometime later, Carmen amputated her hand. I found her on the floor in the bathroom, curled into a ball, soaked in blood. So much blood I thought she couldn't possibly have any left in her body. Somewhere in the mess was a hammer she'd used to break her wrist and the saw that had done most of the deed. However, Carmen underestimated how difficult it would be to amputate a limb by yourself. As I pried her arms apart, I saw her hand was still attached to her arm, if only by scraps of flesh and frayed tendons. It got inside me. She wept. I had to get it out. Dr. Lopez wouldn't allow me to call the paramedics again. He put the little resort into lockdown, The archaeologist and paleontologist left despite his warnings, no doubt shaken by the recent death and mutilation. They would come back for the shark when the others arrived. I secured a tourniquet on Carmen's arm while Dr. Lopez removed the rest of her hand. We bandaged her, but she was catatonic. Chase, we have to get her to a fucking hospital. I begged. She needs a transfusion. She'll die. We can't risk it, he said. Dr. Lopez dropped the severed hand into a Tupperware container. We don't know what the tide could do if it got out. Got out? It's not some contagious disease. We don't know what it is. Lena. Carmen never fully regained consciousness. Dr. Lopez took my phone when I was tending to her, leaving me unable to call for help even if I wanted to. I was terrified now, not just of the black tide, but of my supervisor. He was changing. Paranoid. Shifty. He spent nearly all day inside the fridge with the specimens. That night, I went out alone to the shore. I sat on the sand and watched the black tide sit motionless on the water, absorbing light. So dark it seemed biblical. I stared into the abyss for an eternity, waiting for something to be revealed to me, some divine vision. Pinpricks of light, just like the ones I had seen several days ago when we took our first dive. They came into view slowly, blanketing the tide with the night sky once more. Each one's luminosity ebbed and flowed like heartbeats. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I was sitting on the edge of a planet, gazing out into infinite space. Lena. Doctor. Lopez had come after me. I think it was to prevent me from escaping to call for help, but he unknowingly saved my life instead. I snapped out of my dreadful trance and got to my feet. The stars were gone, and it remained as I'd seen it before. No longer beautiful, but repulsive in its vastness. Those stars must have been what Gabriel saw before he walked into the void. We went back inside, and he admonished me. Think of what happened to Gabriel. He said, do you want that to be you? There's something wrong with it. I know there is. Then we heard it. Thumping. Rhythmic. Like a heartbeat. Coming from the fridge. Dr. Lopez and I approached it cautiously. Standing in front of the door, I realized that the thumping was coming from lower down on the thick door, perhaps just a foot or so off the ground. What is that? I asked. He paled. I don't know. Too terrified to open the door, we retreated to our beds. But the thumping continued throughout the night. Hours and hours I couldn't sleep, waiting for the sun to rise and make everything seem less frightening. It was nearly 5 in the morning when Dr. Lopez rose and declared enough was enough. We're scholars. God damn it. And we're acting like children. Chase. Wait, I pleaded. He was right. We were like 2 kids afraid of the closet. We were scientists, doctors. The black tide didn't have thoughts or feelings. Gabriel drowned, and Carmen was mentally ill. There was an explanation for everything if you looked hard enough. We stood outside the fridge's door again, listening to the thump, thump, thump. I stood behind Dr. Lopez as he reached for the handle and opened the door. Gabriel, naked on his hands and knees, continued to thrust his head into the space where the door had been. The top of his skull was bloody from hours of impact. The realization hit me like a brick to the face. He's alive. Doctor! Lopez didn't move. He can't be. Then plop. One shark fell from a shelf and flopped helplessly on the floor. Another followed. Then all the fish began to move. The room full of dead things animated, and they were all alive once more despite being out of water for several days. Wet slapping filled the air. Even the hibiscus was alive, wriggling its way toward the open door. Gabriel remained on his hands and knees, but dragged himself forward, head hanging limp between his shoulders as if it were too heavy to lift. A trail of black water dripped from his slack jaw. Doctor! Lopez slammed the door on him. Chase, I cried. I wept freely now, unable to cope with the sight of the alive dead. We have to help him. Open the fucking door! He isn't alive. None of those things are alive. It's impossible. I reached for the handle, but Dr. Lopez shoved me away. I stumbled backward and lost my balance, landing hard on the floor. He loomed over me. Don't you dare! How can you just leave him in there? "We're going to call the main lab," he replied. "Doctor." Lopez pulled his cell phone out and rang the number right there, standing with his back to the fridge. It rang, and rang, and rang, then no one answered. He cursed. "What the hell? They're a 24-hour lab. Damn it." He tried again. 3 more times. 2 more. He gave me my cell phone, and I tried them too. The lab didn't answer. Suddenly, I felt the weight of our isolation. Gabriel's thumping resumed inside the fridge. The black tide was retreating. "Doctor!" Lopez and I stood alone on the shore, unburdened by the click-click-click of photographers, watching the darkness shrink away from us. It was moving, all of it, floating slowly out into the open ocean as one great mass. The smell of blood dissipated as it got further away from the beach. "Where is it going?" I asked. "Doctor!" Lopez shook his head. "I don't know." We could hear Gabriel and the fish slamming around inside the resort from where we stood. They were louder, more frantic. Gabriel even began to scream, a long, hoarse wailing that filled me with a sense of dread and nausea. It was a mournful cry, something you might hear at a funeral as the casket is lowered into the earth. "I think, Doctor," Lopez finally said, "that they want to go with it." As the black tide melted into the horizon, I saw the stars glimmer across it once more. Attention, teachers and students. Recess is cancelled today due to crows. That is all. There was a collective all from the students, but that wasn't what had gotten my attention. Had the principal just said crows, like the birds? I asked myself as I told my 3rd graders we would play Heads Up 7 Up. As they got set up to play the game, I picked up the phone and called a friend of mine in the other class. Kayla had been helping me integrate into the flow of Jefferson Moore Elementary since I'd arrived here at the start of the year, and I could hear the smile on her face as she answered the phone. "Mrs. Swearington's class." "Crows?" I asked without preamble. Did I hear that right? "You did. The school has a code for crows, and you should definitely follow it." I was quiet for a moment, trying to find a good response to that, until she said my name like she might have lost me. "I mean, are crows different in Ohio? Because we had crows in Maine too, and we didn't close down the playground for them." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of a very heated argument going on over what I assumed was a game of Heads Up 7 Up. Great minds thought alike, it seemed. "Crows here are a little different. I can't really talk about it right now. Meet me after school for drinks and I'll fill you in. Don't worry. Though, crow days only usually last a couple of days." "A couple of days?" I said in disbelief. But that was when someone started crying, and Kayla said she had to go. She hung up and I was left with more questions than answers. It wasn't that much of an inconvenience, I supposed. My kids, despite being 8 and 9, were pretty well behaved. I had very few fights, very little beyond the usual drama that surrounded little kids, and most of them were good friends who helped each other. My own game of Heads Up 7 Up was full of more laughing than arguments. And as recess ended, we started math and worked toward lunch. Good kids or not, it was still going to be a long day without recess. Even the best-behaved kids get stir-crazy when they can't blow off steam on the playground. Luckily, we had gym today, so they could get their zoomies out in the fully enclosed gym building instead. We walked across the school, me leading the line as we headed for the gymnasium, and I couldn't help but glance at the playground as we walked past. Even as an adult, I thought the new playground looked pretty cool. They had replaced all the old metal equipment with colorful plastic, and it made me wish I could take my tie and my sensible shoes off and just go play with them for a while. There were 5 large, colorful structures, teeter-totters, slides aplenty, a 4-square court, some of those spring animals, a big sandbox, a basketball court, and lots of shady places to sit and visit with friends. It was an amazingly inviting place, but today it looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. The crows had taken over every inch of the playground, and they lay thick upon the land. They watched us as we passed, looking affronted to see people so close. I understood now. It was a little intimidating to see that many crows assembled. They called a group of crows a murder, and the name made sense now. They looked capable of anything as they sat there glaring at us. They looked capable of hurting even me in such numbers, and I turned my back on them with a real effort. They were still there when the bell rang to release students for the day, and I noticed that no one went anywhere near the playground as they headed for home or the bus. Kayla shot me a text as I was walking to my car to let me know that she'd had to go home with stomach problems, but that she would meet with me soon to let me know the story behind the crows. Just don't do anything dumb in the meantime. I don't want you to get in over your head. I rolled my eyes at her text, but decided I would toe the line until I had more information. I had to admit that something about that group of crows had spooked me, and I suddenly didn't like the idea of just going out there and scaring them off. I didn't know how they would react, and I wasn't in a big hurry to find out. I had joked that we had crows where I was from, but I didn't think I had ever seen crows like this. I must have been thinking about them as I lay down to sleep, because I dreamed about them that night. I was walking onto the playground, the crows sitting around me and staring in disapproval. Everything beyond the playground was in mist, like I was standing in a fog bank, and the deeper I went into the playground, the more crows there seemed to be. In the center of the playground was a merry-go-round, the old metal ones that often injured the children who went to play on them. Standing in the center of it was a man, slowly rotating with the motion of the thing. He had his back to me, and I saw that he wore a coal-black coat with a high, dark mantle. His top hat was lined with feathers and shiny trinkets, and his boots were black and thick. He was rotating slowly, the old engine of destruction squealing as it turned ever so slowly. The crows were looking at him, their beady eyes drawn to him, and as he spun, I became afraid. I didn't think I wanted this man to look at me. I thought that if he looked at me, something terrible might happen, but I was powerless to look away. He just spun like a ballerina in a music box, and as he came around, I saw one glittering eye before I woke up in a cold sweat. There was another warning about the crows during the morning announcements, but it was hardly needed. We had all seen them as they perched on the playground equipment as we came to school that day. I was working the pickup line that morning, and the reactions of the children weren't what drew my attention. The children were disappointed but understanding. No, it was the reaction of the adults as they caught sight of the crows. There were some transplants, like me, who looked at it like an oddity, but it was the local parents that really caught my eye. They looked at the playground like a source of childhood trauma, and many of them made sure to tell their children not to go to the playground under any circumstances. "Keep a close eye on her," one mother said to me as her kindergartner walked inside, her pink coat making her stand out amongst the sea of children. I had hoped they wouldn't come back this year. "Damn him," she whispered, and then looked at me like she had said too much before driving off in a controlled hurry. We settled in for today's lessons, but you could tell that the mood was muted. They didn't have gym to look forward to today. The extracurricular was music, and they knew that there would be no real outside activity today. I hated it for them, and when I called Kayla at about 10:30, my text going unseen, I was in for another surprise. The woman who answered said that Ms. Swearington was out today, and might be out for the rest of the week. Poor dear. She caught that bug that's going around. I hope she didn't leave it behind when she was here yesterday. I hear it's nasty. I didn't even have lunch with my friend to look forward to, it seemed, and I settled in for a long day. As the class played hide and seek during indoor recess, I noticed that one of my students was still at her desk. Lisa was coloring up a storm, really putting swirls on her paper, and I came up to check what she was drawing. She looked absolutely focused on what she was doing, showing no interest in the other students or their games. It was odd to see that kind of focus in a kid her age, and she jumped a little when I came up behind her and tapped her shoulder. "What you—" I started, but when I looked at the page, it took my breath away. She had drawn the playground from my dream perfectly, complete with the man in the dark cloak and top hat. He was standing on the merry-go-round, arms extended to the sky, and the crows were flying all around him. The picture was way too detailed for someone her age. much too good for someone not even in middle school. And when she looked back at me, she asked if I had seen him. "Who?" I asked, though I knew who she meant. "The Crow Count," she said, matter-of-factly, as if it was something that everyone knew. "I haven't," I lied, picking up the picture and getting a better look. "Who is he?" "Mommy says not to talk about him," Lisa said, looking guilty, as if realizing she shouldn't have been drawing him either. "I won't tell," I said as I put the page back on her desk. "Is he a friend of yours?" "No," Lisa said, and she sounded afraid of the idea that someone might think he was friends with her. "The Crow Count isn't anyone's friend. He brings the crows here. At least that's what Mommy told me. She said I must never go into a big group of crows, or the Crow Count will take me away with the murder." Hearing someone so young say these things made me cold all over again, but I just patted her arm and said that was very interesting. It was the most normal thing in the world to her, apparently, and I didn't want to draw attention to the fact that this was my first time hearing about it. I left her to her coloring, telling my students they had about 5 minutes left for indoor recess before going back to my desk. I googled Crow Count and crows in Ohio, but I didn't get much. Crows in Ohio brought up memes, because of course it did, but Crow Count brought up only a single entry. It was an old Germanic legend about a ruler of crows who sometimes took children to feed his flock or young girls to be his bride. Neither were ever seen again, but it was the excuse for telling children to avoid large groups of crows, something associated with battlefields and death. The depiction, something taken from an old storybook, was very familiar. A courtly fellow in a tall hat with feathers and a dark cloak. I clicked off a fit, feeling my stomach tie itself in a knot, and began geography. I was still thinking about it at the end of the day as the bell rang and everyone headed for home. The playground was still full of crows, and it was hard not to imagine that I could see someone on the playground among them. Could that be the hatted gentleman? The Crow Count. I didn't dare look too long, but I was beginning to get a little tired of this. 2 days with no outdoor recess was beginning to take a toll on my students. I didn't know what we'd do if this went on much longer, but it appeared we'd never find out. After a night spent dreaming about crows and the man in the tall hat, I arrived at school to find a group of adults standing around the outskirts of the playground. The crows were giving them an unhappy look, looking like bouncers preparing to kick them out, and I approached the group to see what was going on. The teachers looked at me guiltily, not seeming to be sure what to say, until Mr. Simonson, the 5th grade English teacher, stepped up and said one of his students had gone in there. Samantha Parks was walking across the track, heading for her first class, when she stopped and looked at the playground. It was like something had entranced her, and she walked slowly away from the track and headed into the playground. "Has anyone gone in after her?" I said, afraid the birds might hurt her. The others shook their heads, and I felt a rage bubble in me as I dropped my bag and walked toward the playground. Crows or no crows, I was going to let a student get injured without trying to help them. Mr. Simonson caught my arm as I tried to go in. "He won't like it if you disturb him," he whispered, looking ashamed as he said it. "Who?" I asked, squaring my shoulders and looking at him darkly. "The Crow Count." He looked surprised that I knew the name, but when he let me go, I walked straight onto the playground and away from the pack of cowards. The crows watched me, hostility in their beady eyes, but they made no move to attack me as I walked among them. It was exactly like my dream. The crows covered everything, their numbers having risen in the 3 days they had been here. Their murder was huge, the equipment looking like a giant crow as they Saturday on every empty surface. It was a mass of wings and feathers and beady black eyes, and I walked within that heaving black sea of avians. I came to the center far too soon. He was standing on a merry-go-round, the metal battered and the paint faded and chipped. It looked as if it had been moved through time, and he stood in the middle of it as it turned ever so slowly. The crows guarded him, leaning closer as if making ready to charge me if I tried to attack him, and he seemed utterly at ease. He was dressed in the same black hat with feathers around the brim, The same black cloak, dark as a raven wing, and the same leather boots that looked like they had walked across the ages to be here. He looked like he could have known Vlad Tepes, could have watched an original Shakespeare play, could have wielded a knife as it slew Caesar. He was ageless, an engine of destruction as much as the one he stood upon, and as he turned, I saw the girl kneeling on the hot top. She was tall for 10, looking like a woman more than a child, and when I took a step toward her, the man spoke. "Do not touch what belongs to the crows." I stopped, despite myself, and as I looked up, I finally got a look at him. His face was young, his hair a perfect salt and pepper, and his features were sharp and angular. He looked like a painting in a museum, a man out of time, and as he came fully around, he looked like nothing so much as a demon in human form. His eyes, however, were what drew me the most. They sparkled, the cornea like the faucets of the gem. No wonder the crows followed him. His eyes were something they would desire above all other things, and I wondered if they would take them from him when his life finally came to an end. Somehow, despite being captivated by this strange man, I found the courage to speak. "She does not belong to you. She is of this school, and under its protection, under my protection." The man sneered. "You would dare tell me what treasures I may take? This is my domain, and I take what I want." "Not today," I said, and the girl shook off whatever spell she had been under and began to hyperventilate. Where am I?" she asked, and I tried my best to calm her down. That seemed to be what the crows were waiting for. They flew at us suddenly, buffeting the two of us with their wings and raking at us with their claws. Crows may not seem very formidable, but they're bigger than you think. And there were so many of them that all I could do was pick a direction and run. As long as it was away from the crow count, I didn't give a damn where it went. I pushed the girl in front of me, leading her through the throng of crows and getting pretty cut up in the process. I heard her scream as I covered her with my body, putting a hand over my face as I tried to save my eyes. We were running blind, bumping into things and rebounding back before we chose a different way. I felt like we would never make it out, that the crows would bury us under their mass or just carry us away. I didn't think I'd ever see my class, my students, or anything ever again, and that was when I stumbled out of the cloud and out of the playground. I lay on the ground, covering myself, but the crows were gone. I was breathing heavily, reaching for the girl to reassure her, but she wasn't there. I looked around, trying to find her, but she was just gone. Where was she? Had she escaped? What had? But that was when I heard a massive push of wings and the raised voice of the murder. As I looked up, they all took flight at once, ascending into the sky in a great wave of black wings. In the middle of the cloud, held between the claws of many crows, were a pair of people that were soon lost amongst the cloud, one in a tall hat and cloak, and another in the uniform our students wear. All I could do was watch them go, the tears coming as the murder took flight and left our playground behind. The other teachers came up then, helping me to my feet as they took me to the office. The principal was expecting me, and she told me to take a seat as the nurse came in to treat the multiple cuts and abrasions. "I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way. It's why we don't often hire outsiders. They don't understand, and it gets many of them killed, or worse." I had 1,000 questions, but I was in shock, and I could not vocalize any of them. The crow count is a part of the town's history. He's something that has always existed and always will. He comes, he takes, he leaves. In the years he does not take, we celebrate. In the years when he does, we mourn. That's why we have the crow warnings, why we teach our kids to be on their guard, and why the parents are so fearful. We know he will take if we give him the chance. There is nothing we can do about it. The crow count is old and clever, and nothing will stop him. Best to accept it. He never takes more than we can afford. I wondered if the parents I saw consoling each other as I went to leave would agree that it had been a price they could afford. I'm sitting in my apartment now, and I'm 3 sheets to the wind. I don't know if I can keep teaching here, knowing that the crow count will be back again, But I don't know what else I would do. I love the job and I love the kids, and if I can keep them safe, then don't I owe it to them to stay? Also, I want to know more about this thing. I want to know what it's here and how it came to be here. Also, I want to know why it takes them and what it does with them once it has them. Above all else, I want to know how we can stop this from happening and stop the crows from stealing what is most precious to us. One day, there's no more room in heaven. The pearly gates are closed. All the angels come on down. Come on down. It was just a nursery rhyme my grandfather used to sing, a reminder to be good and to accept things for what they are instead of needlessly holding on to the superficial. A story of heaven being closed and even the angels being left outside. I remember asking him once what that world would look like. He stroked my hair, held me tight, and sighed. "You'll see, dear boy," he whispered. "I'm sorry, but you'll see." My grandfather has been gone for a long time now. His ashes were spread on the lavender fields outside Tomskog, Minnesota. Part of me still get this sinking feeling when I think of him, and another part of me just hopes he made it through the gates. No, I'm not a very religious person, but a sentence can paint a concept, and a concept can be a powerful thing. Maybe there is no pearly gate in the sky, but maybe there is a sense of peace to experience in our final moments. That's all I can hope for, both for him and for me. All throughout my life, I've had this idea lingering in the back of my mind. It hasn't really affected me in any particular way, but it is something I haven't been able to forget. But some time ago, it became relevant in a way I would never have imagined. I was working at a cafe at the time. Nikki was my closest co-worker. We shared every shift, and she was just a beam of light wherever she went. She was half the reason we had as many customers as we did. She was simply a delight, and she made every regular feel seen. She was kind, honest, and genuine. At the end of every shift, she'd ask me not just to have a good one, but to have the best one, a quirk of hers. Then, she had a brain aneurysm. Most people don't survive it, but Nikki did. Maybe it was a mild one. We were all waiting anxiously for an update. And eventually, word came down. Nikki was going to be all right, with little to no permanent damage. She was going to return to work once her recovery was done. There was a palpable sense of relief in the air, both for us and the regulars. Everything was going to be okay. Of course, that's not what happened. When Nikki came back, she had visibly changed. It wasn't much of a surprise, given what she'd gone through, but it was clear that something drastic had happened. Even at a glance, she'd lost about 20 pounds and must have shaved her head at some point. It had just started to grow back. She looked like she hadn't slept for days, and there was a tilt to her stance. She was hunched over, as if needing to lean on something for support. Still, it was Nikki, and we were all relieved to see her back behind the register, even if her smile was a bit crooked. But there were many changes. They were subtle at first. She would forget the occasional name or spell something wrong. I figured it was just a leftover from her aneurysm, something that would go away over time. She was supposed to make a full recovery, after all. But seeing the way her eyes glazed over as she talked to other people made me wonder, was she making an honest mistake, or had she stopped caring? I remember ending a shift with her, and as we closed shop, I waved goodbye. I was expecting her to say something back, like she always did, but she didn't. She didn't ask me to have a best one, or even a good one. She just stood there in complete silence, her eyes 1,000 miles away. So instead, I took the initiative. I got back in the cafe, walked up to her, and cleared my throat. "You all right, Nikki?" I asked. "Yeah," she sighed. "I'm good. Great. You seem what?" She turned to me, clearly not interested in discussing the topic further. Expecting an answer, she went quiet. I shrugged it off. "Nothing. I smiled. You have a good one. Yeah. And that was that. Over the next few days, I noticed more and more things that were off about her. She would not only forget her regulars, but actively snap back at them. She'd mess up her orders. At one point, she almost broke the microwave in the break room. She just stood there, watching the plate spin as the spoon she'd left in her cup sparkled. She knew it was wrong, she just didn't care. But I didn't say anything, and I didn't step in, not until I noticed her shortchanging an older man. He owed $6 and handed Nikki a 50. She gave him $34 back, trying to pocket a 10, skim a little off the top. It was pretty smooth. Really. She counted 44 fall, but left the 10 out when she handed the money over. That's when I stepped in, trying my best to make it look like an honest mistake. The old man didn't seem to mind. He'd always liked Nikki. She turned towards me and gave me this look. I'd never seen it before. A joyless smile behind darkened eyes. A look that said she would do her best to ruin my day. Thank you. She smiled. I would have felt awful. She wouldn't. I don't know how I know, but I saw it. There was no hint of regret behind that smile. I tried to be sympathetic. I'd heard about people having personality changes after massive personal trauma. It's to be expected. But Nikki hadn't just changed. It's like I was looking at a stranger. None of her enthusiasm was there. There was a callous disregard, and even disgust, towards the things that made her so wonderful to begin with. But that also gave me a frightening thought. From all the things I'd seen her do, what else was she doing when no one was looking? How far would she go, given how she'd been ready to scam that old man? Did I even want to know? During our next shift, I tested her. I'd come back at irregular times, checking in on her when she thought I wasn't looking. She'd be on her phone, leaving the freezer open, forgetting to lock the back door, and, strangest of all, smoking. I'd never seen her smoke, and all of a sudden, she was doing it in the break room. But the final straw was at the end of the workday, when I saw her pocket money from the register. It was a complete accident that I noticed. I'd gone back to get a napkin and caught her red-handed. We looked at one another across the room. Her face was like a brick wall, but I could see it tremble. It cracked to reveal that joyless smile, and those unblinking, dark eyes. You didn't see what you think you saw, she said. I think I did, I answered. No, you didn't see shit. She approached me. Even her walk was different. She got within an arm's reach and put her hands on her hips, tossing an apron over her shoulder. Who do you think you're talking to? She smiled. You think you know me? You think you know this person? Nikki, you gotta stop, I said. This has to stop. This has to nothing. She laughed. And you know why. She leaned in close. I could hear her bite down, as if forcing her jaw shut. Her voice was spiteful, angry, like she was holding back something terrible. Because if I hear that you've said anything to anyone... Nikki took a step back, letting her cheerful facade fall back into place. And with the same joyful smile as ever, she put up 2 fingers, playful little scissors. But snip, snip. I talked to the manager the next day. I hadn't planned on it, but I couldn't stay quiet. I told her about the threats, the register, the change, the smoking, all of it. I tried to be clear that I cared about Nikki, but that she was harming the place, and herself. My manager didn't seem all too surprised. Apparently, others had taken notice as well. She was going to talk to Nikki later that day anyway. I just added fuel to the fire. I felt awful about it, but thinking back on that little snip-snip, yeah, no. I didn't even want to begin considering what she would be capable of. There was no way to know anymore. Whatever had happened to Nikki, it had made one thing certain. I had no idea who this person was anymore. She was let go soon after. I wasn't there for it, but my manager was visibly upset afterwards. She didn't want to talk about it, so I can only imagine what had been said behind closed doors. I thought that'd be it, but that was only the beginning. The morning of the first shift without Nikki, I was the first on site. Right outside the door was a pair of scissors neatly laid out. Next to them were a handful of sunflowers with their heads cut off. They'd been thrown to the side and left in the dirt, turning a bright blue in the process. Didn't know they did that. There was no doubt in my mind that this was a threat, and I could feel an unease settle in my stomach. An ever so light sweat crawled across my skin. Just as I was about to open the door, a thought washed over me. I checked under the handle, noticing a razor blade taped to the back. Had I pushed down on it, I would have cut a gash across my palm. I removed it and told my manager about it, but there was nothing we could do. The security cameras for the back area hadn't worked for months, something that Nikki knew all too well. Throughout the day, I couldn't help but to wonder what she was going to do next. Maybe nothing, maybe something downright violent. A threat could just be a threat. But there was something in me telling me that I should take it seriously. This wasn't Nikki anymore. If she was willing to do something this demented on day one, what was going to happen on day two? Of course, there were plenty of regulars who asked about her. Most expressed concern, and a couple of them were heartbroken. But what surprised me the most were the ones who were relieved. Apparently, they'd seen something as well. "It's not her anymore," an older woman complained. "It's like she never really came back." Those words stuck with me. Like she never came back. It really felt that way. Sure, people can change, but people like Nikki, for the first time in years, it made me think back to my grandfather. The pearly gates are closed. All the angels, come on down, come on down. For the next few days, the threats were numerous and obvious. A pair of scissors left outside my door, this time accompanied by 2 chestnuts. By lunch, we got a remote order for 3 bagels, with the additional comment, "Keep it. It'll be your last meal." With every poke and prod, I was reminded that there really was no telling with this woman. So yeah, unsurprisingly, my manager got the police involved, and from there it escalated fast. They couldn't find Nikki. Her place was an abandoned mess. Her car had been impounded after being left in the open street. Her bathroom was spattered with drops of blood, seemingly her own. And she was nowhere to be found. We managed to convince the local sheriff that a patrol car ought to come by to check on the shop every hour or so. But us who worked there seemed to be fair game. There wasn't evidence that Nikki was the one behind it, even if everything pointed to it. Still, the threats were real, and treated as such, mostly. 3 days passed without any incident after that. I was beginning to calm down and maybe consider this over. There'd been no word of Nikki, and all signs pointed to her having left town. I came home from work, dropped my keys in the bowl, wiped my shoes, and locked the front door. I stashed away some groceries and grabbed a Coke, leaning against the kitchen counter. It had been a long day, and I had a chicken salad ready to make everything better. That and a guilty pleasure episode of Love is Blind. Don't judge. I stepped into the living room, ready to settle in for the night, when I noticed something. The curtains of my living room window had been moved. I never opened those curtains. I lived on the first floor. I was sitting down when I turned my head towards the bedroom door. My phone was still on the kitchen counter. I couldn't see anyone, but I held my breath. I felt like a prey animal, hoping against hope not to be noticed if I just kept still enough. But no, Nikki noticed. The sound gave her away long before I saw her. The snip-snip of a pair of household scissors, followed by that joyless, dead-eye grin peeking around the corner. I grabbed a vase from the coffee table and got to my feet. At first glance, I couldn't tell it was Nikki. She'd not only cut her hair, but parts of her face. There was a long slit in her nose reaching almost all the way up to her eyebrows. A couple more nips in her ears, as well as her lip. She didn't seem to mind. If anything, it made her smile harder. "Didn't you get the message?" She grinned, and as if to make a point, she snipped the scissors twice and advanced. It all happened so fast. She jumped over the couch, stepping on the cushions with her raw, bloody feet. She threw herself at me with complete abandon, laughing as she tumbled to the ground, tearing the curtains down as she went. I instinctively threw the vase at her and went for my phone, but there was no way I'd get the chance to call for help. She was after me. Instead, I grabbed the first thing within reach, my salad knife. It struck her in the throat. Nikki recoiled, pulling out the knife. There was a spurt of blood cast across the white and sky blue kitchen tiles. She just got a bigger smile on her face as her eyes locked onto mine. "You still don't know who you're talking to." Her voice had turned to a sickening wheeze as air escaped the hole in her throat. She fumbled her way towards me as her body struggled to stay upright. She pointed the scissors at me. "You don't know." And with that, she collapsed. I grabbed my phone, stepped over her, and tapped in the emergency service number. I was just about to press the call button when an immense pain exploded in my shoulder. Every nerve in the right half of my body felt like it had been set on fire. I dropped my phone as my fingers cramped, spinning around to see what had happened. There was a light drag coming from my shoulder. Something was stuck in it. Nikki was back on her feet, as if nothing had happened, blood still pouring out of her neck. "I'm Kelly," she said in a cheerful tone, crossing her arms behind her back. "What's your name?" "What?" That's all I had the time to say before she attacked again. The scissors that had been lodged in my shoulder fell to the floor, and I ducked her attack to grab them as I swung around, pushing myself up against the wall for momentum. I attacked her head on, digging the scissors into her left eye. For a second, she was quiet. Her breathing stopped. I could hear my own beating heart and see the pulse rushing through my hands. As a moment passed, she blinked, her right eye unhindered, her left eye pushing against the steel of the scissors. I pushed her away. She should be dead. I'd buried those scissors deep. "Now I'm Emmett," she said. "You should be more careful." A completely different accent and demeanor. She stood up straighter. She adjusted herself, wiping the blood off her cheek. It didn't help. She was bleeding profusely, which seemed to annoy her. She pulled the scissors out, giving me a confused look with her one healthy eye. "Are we killing one another?" She came at me again. I cut her with the shards of my broken vase. Then she said she was Morgan. I cut her with the broken glass from a fallen portrait, and all of a sudden, she was Lillian. I don't know how many times she cut me back. My arms got cut to ribbons, and she managed to get a slice across my cheek that just barely missed going into my ear. I stabbed her over and over with everything I could find, taking out her eyes, throat, heart, lungs. Her stomach looked like a knife block, and still, she was coming at me. "I'm Roy," she gargled. "You're gonna love me." She seemed to literally grow, her arms extended, her legs bending at unnatural angles, snapping to attention as her bones settled into her sockets. She ripped off the power cable from a nearby lamp, biting it loose. She didn't care that it cost her 3 teeth. She wrapped the cable around her hands, ready to strangle. Another tooth drooled its way out of her mouth as I was cornered in the bedroom. I tripped over a chair I kept by the bed, breaking it. An old wooden chair that pretty much came with the apartment. I ended up on my back, looking up at Nikki as she came at me with a childlike enthusiasm. A blood-dripping tongue panting with enthusiasm. I managed to get under the bed, but she wrapped the cable around my foot, dragging me back out, kicking and screaming. She was squeezing my ankle so hard I thought it was going to pop off. Then, a siren. The neighbors must have called the police. As Nikki turned her head, I grabbed a chair leg. Heaving myself forward, I managed to get a solid smack across her jaw, causing her to topple over, pressing my advantage. I crawled on top of her, smacking her with the chair leg over and over and over. "I'm Mark," she'd say. "I'm Hannah. I'm Benny. I'm Nora. I'm... I couldn't stop, and neither could she. She kept coming back. Even after the structure and musculature of her face turned to mush, she kept going. Long after her words had turned to sounds, I dropped the chair leg. She was barely even twitching. making some ungodly gagging noise. I didn't even notice I was screaming. Maybe I'd been screaming that whole time. It's as if a soul settled back into my body, bringing my actions into perspective. I'd been beating her to death, but death it wouldn't come. I could hear sirens coming closer as I wept. Two of her fingers carefully stroked the palm of my left hand as she opened her mouth, and with a Herculean effort, she turned her blind face towards me. "They're nothing," she gargled. "They're nothing." And as those empty eyes locked into mine, she said her final words. "Come on down." The police broke down the door and pulled me away. I barely even remember where they took me. I was so dissociated that I only remember the lights. A dark corridor, a bright ambulance, a flashlight checking my eyes, distant voices, introductions. "I'm nurse this, I'm doctor that, officer, sheriff," all asking 1,000 questions at once, and only one stood out. "Do you understand?" And no, I didn't. They ruled it as a psychotic self-defense episode brought on by harassment and mania. There were investigations, evaluations, sessions, everything. I think there was a Dr. Bogan somewhere in there. It passed in a blur. I don't think I could think straight for well over a month after that attack. It's like it uprooted something deep and disturbing within me. But over time, well, what else can you do but to live? That's what I did. Now people know me around town as the guy who survived a home invasion brought on by some kind of stalker woman. I'm okay with that narrative. I don't want to consider what they really ought to call me. What even am I? What was she? I have to stop calling her Nikki. Nikki was long gone. Maybe she never came back to begin with. The scars are still there, but they don't bother me anywhere near as much as those final words. As that eyeless face looked my way, choosing the words that I know only one person would pick. "Come on down." Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.